podcast for those who suffer, which is everyone.
It's a space where we can speak honestly about what it feels like to be in desolate places without losing hope.
Welcome to In the Thicket.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Lenten series, which is on Salvifici Doloris. It's an apostolic letter from John Paul II on the Christian meaning of human suffering. And this week we're looking at sections 1 to 8, and you don't have to buy a book or anything. You can go to Vatican.va or just Google Salvifici Doloris, and you'll be able to find it and read along for free. Sections 1 to 8 are kind of an introduction to what is suffering, and then some defining of suffering and looking at its root and connection to evil. And it sets the stage for the rest of the weeks that we'll be talking about. So we hope that you enjoy it, and we hope that you'll join us for the rest of this Lenten series. God bless you. Hope your Lent is going well so far.
Hey, you guys. How's it going?
Hey. Hello.
All right.
Good day to you all. I've learned not to say good morning or afternoon or night because...
Well, you know what, though? So I was working at I do like clinical supervision for some of my music therapy students, and we work at like an after school. I began to an after school program, and so we were at this after school program, and then one of the school custodial staff walked in, and our kind of counterpart who works at the school, she says to him, "Good morning," and he says, "Good morning." It was like 4:30 p.m.
Awesome.
And then they both were laughing, and I realized like, oh, this is like a thing. And then he was like, yes. He's like, I'm here like all the time, so it doesn't matter, morning, noon, night, whatever, it's always good morning, like whatever, and he was like kind of sarcastic but kind of joking, and I was just like, I like that, just say like good morning, because good morning is like cheerful or something. And
that's
good morning all the time. So
it is. Yeah.
Like
I mean too. I guess it depends on how much of a morning person you are. Like if somebody says good morning, she might be dramatic.
True. Yeah. Oh, that's fair. I am a bit of a morning. Like I'm one of those strange morning people where it's like once I'm up, I love the morning. It's like it's the most productive time of my day. And once I get out of bed, I'm like almost immediately awake. I don't have much of a lag time between out of bed and like mental alertness. But the waking up is just, it's dramatic. Like, is it going to happen in the morning? Question mark. There's like all kinds of the snooze button. How many times are we going to hit it? I'm not one of those people. I'm not a heroic moment person. I'm terrible at that. Even if I decide with all my might the night before that the heroic moment, I'm going to wake up when the alarm, my body overrides my intention, and I just won't do it. So it's like,
I'm the opposite. I can have every intention to sleep in, and I'm like, tomorrow morning, I'm going to sleep in. And like 6:29 rolls around 1 minute before my alarm, and all of a sudden I'm just like, oh, I'm super awake. And then I look and I'm like, oh, this is awful. And then I sleep in.
That's amazing. I feel like I get the best of both worlds. Like on days where well, actually, it's kind of the opposite of the best of both worlds. Anyways, on days when I have to wake up for something, then I'm like up 2 hours before I need to be up, and at like 4 a.m, and I'm wide awake because I'm like afraid of missing something. And then after, or on other days when I'm like, I have to be up, or I have to, I get to like have a little bit of a lay-in or whatever, then I get up and I'm still like, I could have slept for 8 more hours and it would be fine,
Yeah.
I just like my bed also because it's an adjustable bed. So it's awesome.
Cool.
Yeah, it has a zero gravity thing. I think I mentioned that before. I know I did because it's in one of our show notes. Logan and Cove beds, highly recommend.
This
episode brought to you.
Yeah. If all of the places that we mentioned like actually sponsored us,
I know.
Have money.
I know, right? Yeah, we could pay for your grad school stuff.
That would be really nice.
Yeah, I could
that in our
pay for. I don't know what I'd spend it on. Probably popcorn.
To eat while in your Logan and Cole or whatever adjustable bed. What is it? Logan and
Cove. Logan and Cove. Yes. Anyway,
come for us, Logan and Cove.
On the subject of suffering.
Yeah.
Well, so we're starting our Lenten series today on Salvifici Doloris. So this is John Paul II's letter on suffering from what year again?
I think I called it a post-apostolic exhortation, but it's actually not a post-apostolic exhortation.
Oh, I think you did call it.
I think
apostolic letter.
An apostolic letter. Yes, exactly.
Oh, 1984.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
1984.
All right. 1984.
Cool. Which is funny because I realized I actually read part of this in my undergrad for a course that I took on suffering and wrote a paper. So I was reading it a little bit and I was like, oh yeah, this thing.
This.
Yeah.
I also just want to say that because I don't know, because it's got it's just the sound of Salvifici Doloris sounds like pasta to me. Every time it's said, it sounds like the name of like a pasta dish.
Is that because like all Italian words sound like pasta to you, Rachel?
Maybe that's a little like, Italian ignorant of me, but like, and it just
wait, but it's Latin. That's what
I know. That's the thing. It's like, it's not but Italian. It does because it has the Italian kind of like,
it does though. It does. Yeah, it totally does.
So I'm so sorry. This is absolutely like, it is not in any way a pasta. But it has the feel
it's similar
of it
because it could be heavy.
It's heavy.
Like the topic is heavy. Pasta can be heavy, hearty. You can chew on it.
That's probably the closest to it. Pasta. My mind, I was like a pasta cast. Podcasta.
A pasta cast. We're on a pasta. Anyways, we're going down a road. I'm sorry to have taken us down, but I just felt I needed to say that. It was just like, there you go. Yeah. But it's not a pasta, it's an apostolic letter, and we're going to talk about it.
We're going to talk about it in parts. There's a lot of little, it's like little tiny chapters with little ideas in each one. I think we're going to cover around 8 today because it's kind of intro, and then we'll do I think 3 or 4 chapters. So if you're reading along with us, it's not hard. And we were talking about this beforehand, and we want these episodes to be appealing both to all of you kind of nerdy, intellectual theology types who are like, give me the meat. I want to understand how all of these ideas work together and cohere and make sense and everything. And those of us who are not so much like that, we're like, we don't care if it all makes sense, on paper. Tell me how it relates to real life.
Right.
And so I think we're going to try to have a combination of trying to talk about the document and explicate it and explain at least some of the basic kind of concepts, but also just tell like, okay, how does this relate to our lives and stories of that to try to illustrate a little bit. So we'll do our best with that. And we hope you join us. I think, it's worth when we're having, a podcast about suffering and thinking about all of these issues and listening to people's stories, telling people's stories. I think it is worthwhile going back to, some of these concepts of, what does the church say about suffering? What is it? Why is it? And even though I think a lot of I'm, for myself, I often find that the intellectual sort of explanations of, well, this is why suffering and this is, is unsatisfying when I'm actually going through something. And yet it's somehow helpful too, in some way. I don't know. So here it is. Okay.
Here it is.
Here it is.
What is here? What are we?
Rachel and Aaron.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
I was like, what is here? Where are we?
What's happening?
No, we're not going that existential today. Only mildly existential.
Yeah. Yes. So I think Rachel and Aaron are going to provide us with a little summary of these first 8 sections today. So Rachel, you want to start us off?
Sure. Start breaking it down. Okay. So we're covering the introduction. The part that I'm going to talk about is the introduction, which really the heart of the introduction is the question, like, why are we even addressing suffering? What's interesting is that this was written by John Paul II, and it was actually written, it says in the intro, during the year of redemption. Like that was the year, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it makes sense because how did our redemption happen? Obviously through the cross. Which is we were talking before the podcast aired, like it's actually really strange, in some ways a very strange thing. It's like the way in which God chose to save us was through this path of suffering. I mean, in other ways, it makes a lot of sense because every person suffers. I mean, that's just a reality of this fallen world. But it's kind of interesting that God didn't work in a magic-y kind of way. He didn't just like magic away all suffering or something like that. He like came down into it and then redeemed us through it, so that even suffering has this sort of dimension now of very, very deep meaning. And there's a power in a certain sense that can be accessed only in some ways through a kind of suffering, and so there's a couple of scripture quotes that I think he writes about in the introduction. I think it's helpful for us to highlight just because I think they're central from when we're reflecting on suffering in our own life. So the first one is, from Paul, in my flesh I complete what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is the church. So there's there's this mysterious way in which the sufferings of my life tie into the cross intrinsically, like it's a part of Christ's suffering in some way, which of course is connected to the fact that I'm part of the church. So that's going to be a big part of this document. Aaron's going to talk about it, about the next section. And then Paul says, he quotes, now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. So, there's like this element of joy, which is very strange, right? Like, what does this mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean for us to have joy?
Yeah.
And then part of that, and I'll maybe end with this, is that John Paul II says in the intro, suffering hints at man's nature as sort of something that's someone who's supposed to transcend himself. Man is not supposed to remain sort of within the bubble of himself in his own world. There's a way in which the very nature of his being calls him to go beyond himself in relationship with God and with others. And there's a particular way John Paul II says, and that suffering points to this. It points to that call that we're created for, to go beyond ourselves, towards in love towards God and towards others. Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting thing that I think he's going to unpack for us.
Does he ever?
So yeah, go ahead.
Good.
Aaron.
So I'm gonna the last part. So today we're doing sections 1 to 8. And so in section 5 to 8, John Paul II talks about, he just starts talking about like what does suffering actually mean? Like what is suffering? And giving some definitions to it. And he talks about things like physical suffering versus moral suffering. So physical is like the pain of the body, and moral suffering is the pain of the soul. And he talks about how moral suffering is much more difficult to remediate, the pain of the soul, and how we suffer as a whole person. Like even if your soul is suffering, like it's not like we just have suffering in our thumb and that's the only, like it somehow encapsulates and involves the whole person. And he talks about, like, he points all of the things that he has in Salvifici Doloris are related back to scripture, like to the quotes that you talk about, Rachel, and then to the Old Testament and their view of suffering. So he'll go into that in later places. And then he notes specifically that anyone who suffers is experiencing evil. So he makes it a big point for us to link suffering to sin, like that it is the result of sin. It's linked to evil. It's an experience of evil,
and not to one's own sin necessarily,
exactly,
but just to the sort of global sin in the
reality
world.
of sin.
The reality of
that every experience of suffering is in some way a contact with evil, with the reality of the evil in the world. And then he goes into looking at, there's a really good quote. I won't say it now because that one totally stood out to Nicole, but we're saving that for later. So he relates it to evil and then also to good. And then he looks at how that kind of affects us in relation to other people and talks a little bit about that. And that was the thing that really stuck out to me. So he talks about these two things, like suffering in dispersion and then suffering in solidarity. And so I'll share a little bit about that after. Yeah. So basically just kind of characterizing suffering and putting some definitions in it, like what are we actually talking about when we're talking about suffering? What does it mean? Where does it come from? How does it affect us?
Yeah. And this is just the intro.
Yeah.
I know. But I want to kind of maybe read one quote from section 4 that I think ties us into where Nicole's going to take us, which is like the conversation between what he's saying here and every one of us and the reality that we experience. And it's also kind of connects with our series on the cry of the heart, which is such a great treatment of suffering in sort of experience from an experiential point. But he says, so I'm going to read a couple sentences actually. Born of the mystery of redemption in the cross of Christ, the church has to try to meet man in a special way on the path of his suffering. And I mean, there's more that I'm going to read, but I'm just going to pause here for a second because it's kind of huge, this document. I never really considered how huge it is, because what is one of the biggest obstacles to faith, right? The problem of evil. And really, this is what the Pope is trying to get at in this document, is like, how is it that there is a good God? How is that possible given the
Mhm.
evil we know and we see and we experience
Yeah.
in each and every one of our lives? So,
Yeah.
Yep.
this is what the church has to answer for in some ways. In sort of the defense of God, the church has to stand up and say, this is what suffering, we have to talk about it,
And it's an important question, and we have
Yeah.
to ask it. We
Mhm.
cannot shy away from it, because
No.
if we shy away from it, maybe that's an indication that we don't really like, where if our faith
Mhm.
cannot answer to this question,
Exactly.
then it's
Like
not
trouble.
I
then it's not
preach
worth it.
Christ and him crucified. Like
Yeah.
it's like central,
Yeah.
this is what we preach.
But that's so
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
So the church has to try to meet man in a special way on the path of his suffering. So again, he
Mhm.
really wants to see us like it's all about each one of us. And he
Yeah.
says, in this meeting, man becomes the way for the church. And this way is one of the most important ones. So like, yeah, in this, yeah. Okay. And then he says, this is the origin also of the present reflection, this attempt to try to meet man here, precisely in the year of redemption. A meditation on suffering, human suffering, and he
Mhm.
says three things: evokes compassion, it also evokes respect, and in its own way, it intimidates. And I think this is our fourth year doing the podcast. Like those three words are so characteristic, I think, of our experience
Mhm.
as we've reflected on our own sufferings in our lives and as we've sort of met others, right, on the path of their sufferings, who are guests who come on the podcast and share their sufferings. It literally evokes all those three things in a very profound way, like compassion. We understand the other person because of what's happening in us. There's a kind of, right, there's a
Mhm.
togetherness in this, and respect. There's a kind of holiness. We've talked about this so many times, like a sanctity to the
Mhm.
suffering of another that commands in a way of respect. And it is kind of intimidating. Like,
It's
this is a big
yeah,
problem.
intimidating. Yeah.
Big
Mhm.
problem. So,
Yeah.
okay.
No, that's good. That's a good context.
Yeah.
Okay, the first concept I'd love to ask you guys more about in terms of your own experiences. Erin, you talked about this. So the physical and moral suffering. So let me just reread that little section here. So this is again in section 5. So he says, physical suffering is present when the body is hurting in some way, whereas moral suffering is pain of the soul. And so I'm just curious, have you experienced a time where maybe there's a lot of physical suffering, but the moral suffering isn't there in the same way? And then maybe a time where there is physical suffering, or maybe there isn't, or there's less, but the moral suffering is there. Just to help us kind of differentiate between those two.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I can even share from the experience of like, so if people are just new to listening, I have fibromyalgia, which is a chronic pain condition. And to be honest, I find the pain aspect of it, like the physical pain aspect of it, much more easily um, dealt with, or much easier to kind of come to peace with than I do a lot of the other things, like the way it limits me cognitively, the way that it inhibits relationships, the way like oftentimes I can't remember people's names or some details about things. And that's like I hate that. I hate that part about it, So it's like some of those inner things in this like inner world that I find much more difficult kind of make peace with, or to find the Lord in, or to like there's a greater suffering there in some ways, because physical pain is tangible. It's like I know it's coming from my thumb. I know that it's there. I know that it's like so like I can put my finger on that, so to speak. I can put my finger on my thumb physically, so that's can actually do that. But with the other stuff, it's like it can be very elusive because it touches on so many different parts of me and the my beingness, that it's like I can't nail it down.
Yeah.
And there's no way of remediating it in the same way as there is a physical suffering, where I can put a band-aid on, I can take some aspirin, I can, whatever. Like even the ways of remediating this kind of moral suffering would be things that would actually dim reality, like drinking or sleeping or like stuff like that, right? Or distraction or things like that are actually not good for me.
Yeah.
In a sense, like in the physical realm, there's a fix sometimes, hopefully, to a lot of our physical things. If you break your arm, it can heal. So there's not, it's not the same moral kind of pain. It doesn't have to be in the same way. Whereas when we talk about this moral suffering, it's like there's bigger questions of like, well, why am I suffering? What's causing it? And is there a solution? Even if there was, what would it be? It's just these sort of more vast, less concrete, both causes and solutions, I think, sometimes when there's the moral.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a image that I have where it's like there's kind of, and there's nothing, because here's the other thing, right? The distinction is helpful, but also there's so much like Aaron said, there's like they're together, there's like you suffer as a whole person, so one usually affects the other. But when I think about physical sometimes think of like long distance running or sports in general, right, where it's like just mere physical suffering, like the NFL, the Super Bowl that just happened, is like these players know they're gonna wham into somebody and it's gonna hurt, but it's just physical in a certain sense. It's at the service of this goal that they have, and it's like they're not really worried about it. They're like, whatever, like it's part
and in
of it.
fact the meaning is positive in some way.
Positive.
It's like exciting, and it's towards a certain goal that has all this potential.
That's right.
Versus if the same physical injuries had because you got beat up or something like.
Yes. So the context matters for physical suffering, but then also when the context is evil in some way, right? And so it's a suffering that is harmful and hurting us. It does, like for Aaron, like the fibromyalgia does bring about this moral suffering. And then vice versa. I think in an episode we did on loneliness before, I was saying like, I've experienced loneliness at moments in my life where it was like physical, like it had like a physical dimension to it where it's like pains, it hurts, I remember being fearful one time before like a medical procedure that I had to do that was kind of intense. Like I was kind of afraid for my life, but not psychologically. It was like I could sort of feel the fear as a physical reaction.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting. And I was like, my body was telling me more that I was afraid than my mind or my emotions were in that moment. So the connection between those two just helps us to realize like, we don't suffer in these parts. Really, we do suffer as a whole, we really are.
We can draw these distinctions, but they're not. They're
not discrete. Even on days like if it's like a higher pain day or something like that, it automatically kind of goes into that moral realm of like those, but because they're just so there's so much fluidity there because we are whole persons, right? There's always a moral aspect to suffering, even when it's physical suffering, even when it's a minor one.
Kind of a continuum,
And the other thing,
okay,
sorry.
Another, go for it.
I was just going to say about the moral suffering that he says, in a certain sense, it's more difficult to treat. So if the origin is a moral suffering origin, in some ways it's like more serious because it is sort of more difficult to get at. It has all these physical manifestations. So if you're, for example, like if you have depression or something like that, which obviously I'm not trying to conflate sort of there are spiritual dimensions to all these things, but also physical dimensions, right, to these conditions and experiences. But just taking sort of depression, like typically you're advised to exercise and eat well, and these things are going to help you with your depression, right? So there's kind of a way in which there's a physical redounding that will alleviate some of the moral, but those things only go so far, and that the moral dimension of those things, they're so like you can't, like Aaron said, you can't put your finger on it, and that makes it more desperate and challenging.
Right.
There's also like, because this kind of goes into the thing that the thing that you said stuck out to you, Nicole, was where we're talking about evil, we're also talking about something that doesn't exist. So like evil is a privation of something. It's not a thing in itself, right?
So can I jump in there? So so suffering indicates an experience of evil, and then he says, so the reality of suffering, which indicates an experience of evil, prompts the question of the essence of evil. What is evil? Right. And so Aaron, like you're saying, evil is not a thing in itself. It's a lack. Here he describes it as where did it go? Here we go.
A lack, limitation, or distortion of a good.
A lack, limitation, or distortion of a good.
So it's hard to put our finger on something that isn't there. Like,
I love that.
Because sometimes we're trying to name an evil and put our finger on it in the case of moral suffering, but it's actually a distortion of something good. So then it can actually be more helpful to look at like, okay, what is there lacking, or, but we don't
think that I want.
What is the good thing that I want, which we don't often approach suffering as, right?
Like that is so true. I was in class on where I'm taking class right now on John Paul II's like philosophical work, like before he became Pope. And a classmate of mine did a presentation on conscience
Mhm.
and on free, and someone did something on free will. And somebody made this comment that like when we sinned, we sort of our 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 lives came into contact with sort of a what's the right a dim a diminishing sort of reality, like where instead of becoming more of ourselves, we sort of started to become less of ourselves. So it's sort of like this contact, like Aaron was saying, with nothingness, where we're experiencing nothingness sort of kind of eating away at our substance, so that we're becoming less rather than more of us. And so I was just thinking about this in this intro and Aaron's section that she summarized. There's this intimidation with evil, because not because we're coming into contact with something scary because it's big and large and substantial, but because there's this experience where my substance is like, you feel like you're being destroyed. You feel like you're being eaten away at.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And you really do feel that. You're like, oh, this is
Yeah.
Which is it's creepy. Like it's
creepy.
We know
It is creepy.
Don't like that.
Yeah, I don't like it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Have
it's
you
icky.
So here's a question, because he goes on to say, in the Christian view, the reality of suffering is explained through evil, which always in some way refers to a good. What does that mean? Have you experienced something that can illustrate that?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I'm when I hear that, I maybe think like, okay, you experience some suffering, and if you can go so far to say, well, why am I suffering? Um, why is this difficult? And realize that it's because of a I guess I'm trying to think about sort of my existential questions in life when I was trying to figure out where I feel called in terms of vocation. And there was just like a lot of anxiety with that. Um and I guess eventually realizing that all this anxiety is coming about because I desire a certain good, which is marriage. Um and that good is not in my life, and I'm afraid it never will be. But it actually helped eventually, I wonder, did that anxiety, or did myself being able to, the Lord helping me to confront that, help me to actually recognize the good that I desired, in order that I could then move into towards openness to that.
right.
And but that's kind of I mean, vocation discernment is one thing, but there are much worse types of suffering. And do all types of suffering, can there be, I guess my question is, can there be an alleviation of suffering if it can help us identify what is the good thing that we're lacking? But sometimes that probably doesn't help. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it makes it worse because you're like, oh
Right.
my gosh, I really want this. And
Right.
I don't have it. I'm not gonna, I
Yeah.
don't know if I'm gonna get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think like it makes me think, so like when I did my master's thesis on this, but there, if you're talking about theology of the body and the ability of the body to have like a sacramental nature to reveal things, right? There's this what do they call it? Subcontrario, like through a lack of something, it reveals something. So it's like through the lack of or through the presence of evil, which is a lack of something, then it does reveal this good, but also in some way it's like, it's so interesting because it's so painful, but then also at the same way, it's such a mercy. It's such a mercy for us to have that because it reveals the good that we're created for and the lack that we have. And it basically points out our situation as like, it crystallizes our situation. We are human beings who are living in a fallen world. This is not all there is. Jesus has come, and then it opens up that whole thing. So like, this experience of evil and this lack always points to the good of what Christ has done, because we know what Christ has done, right? Which in the end is a hopeful thing, even if it's still this experience of like deep pain. Like, it opens up these like horizons of hope in a way.
Possibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, right. If I'm feeling, I guess, and the thing is, if I am feeling so strong, if I'm going through X, whatever this is, and it's so strongly difficult, and it can remind me that my experience of how difficult this is not it. It indicates that there is something good. There is something good that I know is supposed to be there.
Yeah.
And it's becoming very obvious that this good thing is supposed to be there, but it's not.
Yeah.
But I guess in Christ, we can hope that this, this pain is not always going to be like this. We will have, even if it's in heaven, it's not, or,
It reminds me of like there's that C.S. Lewis quote that where he said, if I find in myself desires, that what is it? If I find in myself desires, nothing in this world can satisfy.
Yeah, that's right.
I can only conclude that I was not made for here. The only way I can remember that quote is when I sing it in my head.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, that's Brooke Fraser, song by Brooke Fraser. But it's true. Like it's like that, right? Like we recognize like we have hunger because there's food that satisfies. We have thirst because there's water that satisfies that need. We experience this lack of something because there is a fulfillment to that something, which is like the beautiful thing about actually being in touch with our suffering is it opens us up to those questions of like why. Like sometimes we're so afraid of those questions, which I feel like is a huge thing of suffering, like to ignore it, to run from it, all of those kind of things is not is like dehumanizing, when actually the best thing that we can do is let those questions of suffering come up and actually like enter into it, because then that's where like God didn't give an answer to suffering, but he gives himself, like he gives himself to us, right? And it's like we actually come in contact in some way then with the reality that's pointed to by the lack that we're experiencing.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, right?
Yeah. It all sounds real good.
Yeah. What does that look like in an actual person?
And maybe that's not something that we can answer. I think all of these conversations in the end, there is something that is beyond what we can nicely put in an intellectual box. And yet it is still helpful to talk about. So I don't know. I wrestle with this all the time and it frustrates me. But I think, I don't know. I think that's good. I think this is.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I can, like, just as a kind of a final thing, like this was the thing always that sticks out to me, is that when he talks about suffering and dispersion and suffering, communion and solidarity, is like, it's kind of this experience of the lack and the foreshadowing of fulfillment, because each person is unique. The beautiful thing, everybody's unique, everybody has this unique relationship with God, but then also because of this uniqueness, it almost becomes like a challenge in terms of suffering, because our suffering and the way we experience it is totally unique. And this, for me, the reason why this hit so profoundly is because when I first was experiencing this, this more like intense suffering and trying to figure out what I was doing and all those kind of things, it was like I felt so alone, because it didn't matter who was there with me. It didn't matter, the words that they offered or those kind of things. Like there's this place that becomes impenetrable in that reality of suffering and this loneliness that you're in, because nobody can go into that completely unique experience that you're having, right? But then at the same time, because we're created to be in relationship with people, John Paul II talks about there's like this complementarity that we can experience. Like Angela Scola calls it asymmetrical complementarity, which is like for men and women in the sexual aspect, it's like we're created to be together, but physically there's a complementarity that allows that union, right? So then like between someone who's suffering and someone who responds to their suffering to alleviate it in whatever way, there's that same kind of complementarity. Yeah. And it's a foreshadowing of what we'll have in heaven when there's like a completion of that, a real fulfillment of that. But
I saw a bumper sticker that maybe illustrates this today.
Awesome.
Wait, do you want to save it for the God? Were we doing God winks today? I was like,
you could save it for a God wink.
Yeah,
okay, yes,
maybe you give that as a God wink. That'll be our God wink.
All right.
I'm really so curious.
I don't know if
now.
it's gonna ring the same way though. Let me.
Just say it. Just say it.
Okay.
But it was this notion of complementarity and the suffering person and the person who cares for them. So the bumper sticker was, "Don't worry, my dyslexic kid will create a job for your honor roll kid."
Oh man. Okay. All right.
That's so funny. So like But yeah, it's like
There's complementarity.
there's
There it is.
complementarity.
I didn't know how I felt about that bumper sticker, but
Yeah,
there we go.
yeah.
Saying something true.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder too
Mhm.
if this is me being speculative, but if we think about the way that each person uniquely reflects something about the image of God, right? That
Mhm.
no one else ever can or will do. Which means that the suffering that each person experiences, they might have the same life event happen, that they're going to suffer differently because they are a different person
Mhm.
reflecting the image and likeness of God, which maybe then means that the good that is missing, that the suffering if the suffering reveals in a unique way the missing of a unique good, then each person that suffering reveals
Mhm.
unique aspect of the good of God
Yeah.
in some way.
Like
Maybe
in the
that's a little
response or in the communion
heavy.
that's
Yeah.
developed,
And on that, I just want to say in this first section of the letter, he talks about the Bible as a book of suffering in
Yeah.
many ways. And I think it's really interesting, right? Like the way in which God speaks to us is it's just filled with stories of suffering.
Mhm.
And I mean, and there's also the starting quote that we had that, my sufferings complete in a way what is lacking in Christ's sufferings on the cross. It seems that suffering has been given, like, it's sort of the Felix culpa of it all, right? Like we sinned and now suffering is part of this walk to heaven.
Mhm.
And there's a way in which God is now saying to us, like, which is a contact with evil. Again, John Paul II takes that so seriously. But there's also a way in which the redemption reaches all the way down, like the call to redemption
Yeah.
is in some ways marked by the particular sufferings that we are going to live in our lives. So that in the cross that God has given to me in my life, or my crosses that he will give to me in my life, there is a kind of invitation there that for redemption. Like there's an invitation in that cross for redemption.
Yeah.
And like Jesus's remark, like take up your cross, is a very serious
Mhm.
in a way, a command that he's given his disciples. Like not one of them were without the cross. Not one saint is without the cross. And so I think that there's a hope. Like I mean, that's scary too. Like if you want to be holy, you're like, oh boy, the cross, oh
Yeah.
man.
Yeah.
But then you're like, okay, but all of those people, all of those disciples, all of those saints are like me. Like they're not different from me. They're just human beings who want to be happy and are afraid and weak and like don't like suffering, right? All of them. So there is something then to me that there's a mysterious grace that God wants to give us to show us that there's like a gift here somehow. And it's not like pretty intellectual stuff. It's like in the meat and potatoes of our lives.
Like the real visceral presence of God.
Yeah. There has to be, otherwise people would not be able to do that and take up their cross. It's not possible.
Right.
So I think there's a part of me that is like, and I think John Paul II is wanting to get us there to be like, listen, there's a way. I mean, what was his big thing, right? Be not afraid. That was the claim of his pontificate. We've talked about that.
And if we remember the context again, and we've said this many times, and I know we need to wrap up here, but this was Pope John Paul II. He was a man who lost his parents. He lost his family. He was persecuted. He was shot twice. He went through a war. He had to be underground. He like so many of the possible sufferings that you could imagine he went through, the things that we're all afraid are going to happen to us. And yet he still has the audacity to talk about meaning and suffering. And
that's right.
So I think it
has
to
be
lends,
real.
It lends some authority, to say, okay, well, what does this guy have to say?
Yeah. Well, and then it becomes this thing, like one of my favorite quotes from Salvifici Doloris is like, I can't, which seems totally insane. But it says, for this reason, suffering also has a special value in the eyes of the church because it's redemptive. It is something good before which the church bows down in reverence with all the depth of her faith and redemption, which is like an audacious claim, and that will come in later weeks.
There
we go.
We will get there. Yeah,
at least in reading this, if
at
not,
least in reading this. Yeah,
not in our lives over this series, not quite yet.
Yeah,
hopefully, you never know. You never
know. Okay, so for next week, we're gonna do sections 9 to 13. For everybody who's listening and is like, yes, let's
Yeah.
go. And everybody who's like, this was terrible,
Yeah.
just come back. Just come
Try
back.
again. Try us out again.
Don't run from your suffering. Just
And as a reminder, you don't have to buy this. You can just
Oh, yeah.
Google Salvifici Doloris and you will
Yes.
find it for free on the Vatican.va website.
will.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I can do a God. Are we
I
doing
love
God
this
winks?
one.
I can
Sure.
do a God wink.
Yeah, you
All
can
right.
do God wink.
My God wink is that was having the sense over Lent, I should kind of turn to Saint Joe. You know, I guess just getting the sense that he was like, hey, Rach, we haven't hung in a while. You know, come let's be together for a little time. So I've prayed the Holy Cloak Novena for many intentions, like a number of times before. It is intense, y'all.
The Joseph one.
Yeah, it's
Is it
like
the really long one? It's
it's
like
the
15 minutes
really
of
long.
every prayer
Yes.
that ever was invested
Literally.
in
Right.
Joseph in one
It's
thing. Yeah.
yes, it's so intense.
Yeah.
And you guys, you know, Nicole and Aaron know me, and if you've been listening to this podcast, you know I just stink at anything that is arduous,
Like scheduled
schedules and novenas. I
routines.
frequently miss things. And the Holy Cloak Novena is like, if you miss a day, you have to pray it at the end. So if you miss like 12 days, you have to pray 12 times at the end on the last day, which if it's 15 minutes each time, you get the picture.
Gotta book off a couple hours for that.
Yeah. So I was like thinking about this. I was like, all right, I was like, I'm not going to do the Holy Cloak Novena. There's no way. I was like, because I'm also committed to praying a rosary a day. We'll see how that goes. God help me. But this is already a lot for Rachel. Okay. So I was like, I'm just going to do a 9-day novena in anticipation of March 19th, which is St. Joseph's feast day.
Yeah.
I was like, that's great. And I was just sensing I got it right. And then today I had a bunch of chats where I was like, there's a lot going on. Lives, people that I know. I think it has to be the Holy Cloak. I was like, okay. Ready, I'm ready. Take me, Lord. Let's do this. So I just thought that was really funny because I was like feeling like it had to be the Holy Cloak, and I was like, no, let's do the 9-day easy one.
Amazing.
It was like, nope, the Holy Cloak. That's where we're going.
Yeah.
So everybody pray
Lord.
for me,
There we go.
because
that's good.
This is going to be a task.
That's good.
So yeah, my
Beautiful.
God
Awesome.
wink to Saint Joe, being like,
Nice.
we're gonna hang out a lot this Lent.
At first I thought you said Saint Job. And then I realized you said Saint Joe as in Joseph.
No.
Yep, got it.
Mhm.
Although
Saint
Job
Joseph.
would be, you know,
He's not a bad guy to talk to.
he's not a bad guy to talk to. Yeah, that's right.
He's a righteous man, righteous man of God.
There you go.
Oh,
Alrighty.
thanks, ladies.
Yeah. Thanks for listening,
Yeah, thanks for
everybody.
listening.
Yeah.
And we'll
Happy
talk to you
Lent.
soon.
Happy
Yeah.
Lent. We hope your Lent is going great so far. We look forward to chatting with you next week.
Yep.
All right.
Bye, y'all.
God bless you. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of In the Thicket. If you like what you hear, give us a rating and hit that subscribe button. We have new episodes every Monday with more stories and honest conversations about life when the going gets rough and the hope and humor amidst it all. We'd love for you to join our community on Instagram and Facebook at In the Thicket Podcast. While you're there, let us know how we can pray for you. God bless and see you next week.